Welcome to the XY Adviser podcast. To join a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice, head to xyadviser.com. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Spider ETFs. From ETFs to model portfolios, Spider relentlessly pursues new ways to provide solutions to investors' most complex investment challenges. And for investors who want to align their values to their investment strategies, the Spider S&P ASX 200 ESG Fund or E200 could be a sustainable alternative to Australia's flagship benchmark. This material is general information only. Investing involves risks, including the risk of principal. Investors should consider the PDS available at ssga.com before making an investment decision. Products issued by State Street Global Advisors, Australia Services Limited, AFSL number 238276, ABN 420039142225. G'day, Clayton here from XY, chatting with Liz. Thanks for coming on, Liz.
Thank you for having me.
Look, it's we were talking just before we started. I'm definitely surprised we haven't had you on before, but perhaps we've been saving you for this special ethical investment series, which we were chatting about just before we hit the record button. But you were saying there's a lot to it, but there's a lot to it. And then it depends on how deep you want to go into it with clients. And I'm keen to understand what that means.
Yeah, so look, the example I was about to give you was that I had one client in particular who is very strict vegan, and her requirements were such that I couldn't actually meet them. I had to refer her out to a stockbroker to actually pick her a direct share portfolio to sort of work around her specific requirements. So she's sort of at the most extreme end of the spectrum. And, you know, one thing that was an eye-opener for me is that animals, or the exploitation of animals from her perspective, is actually built into every layer of our economy, and it's really hard to avoid it. So when you want to go to the extreme of, like, I don't want to invest in companies that sell meat or that transport meat or that, you know, test on animals, or, you know, it knocks out supermarkets and medical companies, and, you know, it's just like, I'm left with nothing here. So,
right. So you can't even invest in Woolworths because Woolworths sells meat.
Yes, exactly.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's, as I said, the most extreme end of the spectrum I've had. And in that case, I sort of said to her, look, you're getting into direct share territory now, because there's no managed fund in the world that's going to, like, I mean, there's vegan super, and there is a vegan ETF that's listed on the American Stock Exchange, but there aren't any non-super managed funds in Australia that can tick your boxes. Yeah. So you actually need a very specific portfolio of direct shares, and that's not, you know, my wheelhouse, and you're under FCA, you like refer out if it's not your area of expertise. So I did end up, you know, referring her out for that part of the advice, and she just comes back to me for strategic stuff. But it was important that I go through the process with her of, as I said, peeling that onion and getting through the layers of what was actually important to her for me to realise that I couldn't actually help her. So, you know, and then at the other end, people might actually be a lot more relaxed than you think they are. So, you know, I had one client come in and it's like, oh, you know, I'm very concerned about climate change. And this has been something that's coming up a lot since the bushfires in December, January. So like more than it ever has before. And so I said, okay, you're worried about climate change, you know, just how strict do you want to be here? And the answer for him was, well, not very strict. So, you know, I was all prepared to, you know, put him in this tailored portfolio that avoided all of these fossil fuel companies or whatever. He really just wanted companies that weren't just straight out coal, and that were actually sort of moving in, you know, in the right direction. So he was relatively easy to construct a portfolio for. So it's not just, you know, are you an ethical investor? Yes or no? Because if you just ask that question, in my experience, about 50-50, right? Half the clients are like, yep, I want to be ethical. Half of them are like, oh, I don't care. And then there's that awkward silence where they're looking at me like, are you judging me that I don't care?
Yeah. That's definitely a key part of it. I remember the first time I went through this series, I was thinking about how difficult it was to bring the subject up. And the job of the financial planner, our job is to walk a client through really just a journey to figure out what it is that they want. And it's not the role of the financial planner to decide what's good or what's bad. And definitely we want to avoid a position of being, judging. And yet the question around ethical investments is unavoidably almost set up to be an awkward silence. And so I said, I remember going through the first ethical series, and eventually my big learning that I got at the end of it was rather than asking someone if that they're an ethical investor is to use a everyday example to open the conversation. So for example, when you go shopping, do you purposely, purchase eggs that are free range rather than caged? And so that question sort of opened up the continuation and the what you've called the onion peeling, right? And so you can sort of figure out at what stage someone goes, like, I'd never eat an egg. And then another person goes, oh, I'd eat a free range egg. And then the other person goes, no, it tastes better when it's from a cage. And so like, depending on where the individual investor is, and then you just say, sure, like that's great, whatever it is that you want. So yes, there is, I think, a huge part of, because of phasing in, you have to introduce all this. I think a huge part of it is figuring out a way that you can talk about it without it seeming like you're coming from a high and mighty position.
Yeah, absolutely. So I your concrete example is great actually, but I actually just rephrased the question because after a few of those awkward moments, I just asked, are there any particular issues that you're concerned with when you're investing? Like, there's certain industries or stocks you'd like to avoid, and so leave it at that. Yeah, because if you say, do you prefer to invest ethically? It's like, what? Are you saying I'm not ethical?
Yes, exactly. It's a really difficult question. Actually, can you repeat how you decided to position it?
So I just say, look, is there a particular approach that you'd like to take when you're investing, or are there any particular companies that you would prefer to avoid or exposure to certain industries? That's basically how I put it.
That's a much better way, because the last thing you want to do is put them in a position where you're making them feel like, but not even that they're unethical, but even, you're not even consciously minded. Like you don't even want to position it as if it in any way negative. But that's really good, because that opens up the question that, are you already thinking about this? Is this something you're already concerned about? Because the person who answers yes to that, it's the onion peeling begins, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but then if they say no, there's nothing really there, then great, okay, cool. So then the whole gambit's open. I think that's a much better analogy than the caged eggs, Liz. I've got to say.
Well, because the thing with that is that there are certainly clients that don't really care if animals get tortured or not to put dinner on the table, but they do care. Whether they invest in tobacco, everybody's got their own ethical framework, and some people, are very much all human first, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's their values. Other people, value animal welfare just as high. Yeah. So it's the other thing I have found, which has been fascinating for me, is that the answers are really varied. So, some clients are like, I don't like alcohol. Others like, it's gambling is my issue. Obviously, the sustainability and, the climate change thing has suddenly rocketed to the forefront just this year. Not so much now, we're all distracted by the pandemic. But in that, brief period between the bushfires and the virus, it was coming up a lot. It'll change, obviously, depending on what's going on in the world as well, and what news people are reading. So it's very interesting. And clients have actually, clients that I've known a long time, because some of my clients come across from my previous employers. I've had like a 12-year relationship with them.
Wow. And
because, I've worked with them since before, we really thought too much about this stuff. Yeah. I'd only started having the conversation with them more recently. And so some of them have actually surprised me. It's like, oh, I've known you 12 years and I didn't know you felt really strongly about this particular thing. That's really kind of embarrassing. And like, you didn't ask. Like, you're right, I didn't. That's my fault.
That's so interesting. So in that sense and with that frame, that's awesome, isn't it? That I guess one of the positives to take out of this or the phasea, work that has to be done is at least that we've got our hands on an additional question that allows opening up a conversation that probably financial planners, in our whole list of things that an advisor cares about, figuring out, the ethical tilts of their investments, just never made it into that top 10 or so, like there's, I want you to achieve short-term financial, emotional, aspirational goals, medium-term financial, aspiration, emotional, long-term financial, like you've got this so many things that you're trying to achieve that getting to the what makes you feel fuzzy inside from where your money's invested, it's kind of weird. Like it just never became a topic, and yet now it's a big topic. And so it's a big shift, I guess, in financial planning, but looking at it through the lens that you've just given, I mean, it's a perfect example of why it's actually probably a pretty good thing.
Oh, yeah. And look, I went through kind of an awkward transition phase like 4 or 5 years ago where I was asking new clients, but not my old clients. And, you get really almost too comfortable in some of these long-term relationships. You stop being, you think you know them and you stop being curious about them. And it's like, obviously I'd listen if they raised it, but, it's all of the review meetings are sort of very comfortable and, how's the grandkids and, oh, that's nice. And, you put the new carpet down yet, great. And we weren't having these fundamental conversations about their values anymore that I was having with new clients. So I think that's been a real shift that FASEA has brought about, for all that it's brought sort of some grey areas that, some of us are uncomfortable with. It has also added an extra dimension to this, and I'm not sad about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, advisors are constantly wanting to add to the list of things that clients consider valuable, and so for those that do think about this type of stuff, I mean, it's great. What I recently came across some research where the concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Basically, out of the 3 topics, E, or environmental, makes up about 80% of the interest, and then social makes up about 10, and governance makes up about 10. And so, realistically, for lack of a better term, it's the environment. Most people are going to be mostly concerned about the environment. And then if you'd imagine that just like, say, the Green Party, which started out as an environmental thing, but now it's sort of grown into more of a socially conscious political party. And this is internationally, by the way. All Green parties. We might begin to see that. So who knows? Like this year it's bushfires, maybe 10 years down the line, it is, well, are there less represented group identities on boards, so you never know, right? You never know where.
Oh, for sure. This is going to become an increasing issue.
Yeah.
There are already a lot of questions being asked, particularly, in 2020, like about, well, that's an all-white male board where everybody's over 50. Like, is that actually a good look?
Yeah.
And it's, as I said, it's not something that's really been at forefront of mind for my clients, but it's starting to filter through. It will happen. It'll get there.
Yeah. And it is, it's an interesting way, because before ESG investing, if you wanted to get your say across, it was pick up a board on a stick and go marching through the street. And that was about the level of influence that you had. It was crowd protest.
Yeah.
The interesting thing I find about ESG investing is that it's using capitalism to achieve social changes that people want to see. It's in one way, hopefully it reduces the necessity or the need to block traffic in the morning, for example. like that doesn't win anyone's favor, but if enough people start saying, actually, for example, Ingham's Chickens comes to mind, because I think I read the other day that the founder recently passed away, or something to that extent. But we're no longer going to include you in this portfolio because, and I'm being theoretical here, I have absolutely no understanding of the company itself. But let's say that they're not reaching XYZ, requirements, and then all of a sudden, rather than blocking traffic in the morning, there's enough people who are asking to be in certain funds that, capitalism is it's a huge force, and it can be used for good. And I see it actually as a much more effective way to enact change rather than disrupting someone's morning. To me, positive.
I actually, agree with you. And I guess you like to make the point that there are plenty of corporate entities and big ones that are moving much faster on climate change than our government is.
Yeah.
So the corporate world is actually ahead of game.
Yeah.
It's, our current government is, dragging the heels. Obviously, they like coal, and they like the jobs that come from the coal in certain electorates.
Yep.
And that's, that's political. But certainly, there are a lot of very smart people in very big companies, particularly insurance companies, obviously. And even, BHP, for example, is trying to push other members of the Minerals Council of Australia to say, look, it's a thing, guys. You can't actually ignore this. I know, the government's sort of letting us get away with it, if you like, for now. But 10, 20 years down the track, it's not actually economically sustainable to keep going in this way. The money is going to shift regardless of whether our government gets on board or not.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. And it sort of segues into another point that I was going to make today. And that is, there's actually two ways really of influencing these outcomes through investment. And, one is just to avoid it, say I'm not going to invest in that, or, if you dig this out of the ground, I'm not going to be a part of it. And the other is to actually keep skin in the game, actually stay invested, so you've got a seat at the table. And I think a really, good example of that, notwithstanding the debate in our industry around industry funds, good, bad or otherwise, just ignore all of that noise and take the example of Australian Super, who basically, got the CEO of Rio Tinto fired. So Australian Super has $1.3 billion invested in Rio Tinto. And you could say, well, they're a mining company, they've done the wrong thing. If I'm an ethical investor, I don't want to be part of that, blah, blah, blah. But if they hadn't had that kind of leverage, nothing would have come out of the whole incident, where they blew up the historical site.
Yeah.
What they just had, well, when I say nothing, they had their internal review, it wasn't independent. They said, oh, it's a bit naughty. These two guys should give up their bonuses. And that was that. It was actually the super funds that said, hang on, that's not good enough. This is a really bad thing you've done here. Our members are angry. The public's angry. This shouldn't be just swept under the carpet in this way, and, they can just go on and get their bonuses next year. And they forced the board to take action, and, heads rolled and an independent review has been started, not just their little internal whitewash. So if you step away altogether, then you lose that influence. And Rio Tinto would still have existed. Overseas or other investors, with fewer cares to give, would have still held the stock if Australian Super hadn't, and nothing would have come out of it. That's the other thing I put to clients to say, well, you say that you don't want to hold these sort of stocks, but if you just step away from the plate completely, then then nothing sort of changes with these companies. You can actually push from the inside as well, be part of a fund manager or a super fund that has a big enough stake in it that they can push through change that way.
Yes. AMP's another one. A couple of key, their key shareholders were the ones that put their hand up and said, actually, in regards to these events that have occurred recently with some higher, some of their executives, we need them to, I think it was very similar, like not just lose their bonus, but actually move out of the company. And that came from the shareholders themselves. It's definitely, it's a new world which is really good. Like the way that I look at it is, I think capitalism has taken us essentially out of the dark ages, but along with it, we've just dragged some horrible sort of practices along the way, and yet it's simply laziness that doesn't take us to the next level. And the human ingenuity is pretty outstanding. It's pretty phenomenal. We've done some amazing things, and any problem that is currently being experienced in a company, and that the shareholders have a new and increased sense of social awareness, that these problems will get solved. Like enough heads will roll in enough companies that eventually the end result is going to be, actually, we need to do this to ensure that these problems don't happen again. And again, I only see this as a good thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there is a consciousness shifting that we can't just always chase the next 6 months of results.
Of course not.
Because, when companies have such a short-term focus, they're setting themselves up for a long-term implosion. And certainly, a lot of the drama faced by certain firms in our industry could have been avoided if they'd played a longer game and, not been chasing short-term results, short-term bonuses, and not thinking about the bigger picture. And I think, while I suppose, the European economy has been slower and, returns have perhaps been less attractive in the short term over there, they are already thinking in this way. So in Europe, in the UK, it's already, there's the social contract that the companies have. They're expected to take a long-term view. They're expected to think about what's going to look good for them in 5-10 years, not just on the next profit release in six months' time. And I think, we're sort of seeing how, I suppose, extreme capitalism's playing out in America at the moment. Like, it's great for the stock market, great returns, which is, nice. Yeah. But the society isn't well over there. Yeah. And you do wonder, like, how long can that keep going on for? Like, that sort of extreme capitalism, but they don't think about the side costs of, what they're doing, or the environmental impact of all the factory farming and the very fossil fuel intensive practices going on. Yeah. It's sort of like they're just stacking up this big, giant debt of societal, environmental, and government debt too, that's just going to blow up on them at some point. And I don't know, I could be wrong about this for the next 10 years, right? they can still, be going, the economy could be firing along for another decade, but just can't help thinking at a certain point this has got to come apart for them.
Yeah, no, 100%. Compare that to something like China, where China they take a really long view at a lot of things. And it's kind of interesting where for all their faults, and which are many, they at least plan, they're at least able to focus on what's going to make their country better, and not spend every single waking minute clawing for power or keeping others away from that power, which tends to be the rest of the Western world. I kind of like where Australia's been recently. Like, it feels like the first time there's been stability, I swear, in like a decade, where a prime minister hasn't been usurped in the last 6 months. So I feel like we're well and truly ahead of the curve considering our last sort of 10-year trajectory. But sort of that view of being able to focus on the future from a governmental point of view is a huge benefit, I guess, of having a dictatorship, which ultimately it is. But in companies, more to your point, which was for people that are, I guess, attracted to those short-term benefits, those short-term bonuses, those share buybacks that, add no value to the company, and yet, they're just spending profit to basically boost the shareholding value of the directors. There's a million reasons why short-term thinking doesn't work, and yet for whatever reason we're fixated on it. And so that's a really good point. Like, I mean, if in the end, if the balance was after focusing on ESG investing for a handful of years, if we started thinking about the long term, if companies started thinking about the long term, then we're going to see more sustainable businesses. Certainly there's a huge turnover in the American Fortune 500 just because there seems to be so much short-term thinking. But, I guess from where I'm sitting, I'm pretty positive about a lot of stuff. I think everything, I'm not awfully old. I'm 37, but I do enjoy history, and there's ebbs and flows, and, like decades go by where it's pretty tough. And so we might be seeing, I guess, some, especially America, where you mentioned that they're struggling with some things at the moment. I'm ultimately pretty optimistic about the whole thing. I tend to think that they'll get their act together. That's my general view of it. In regards to ethical investing, has it operated or has it attracted, or have you used it, I guess I should say, as an attraction mechanism for new clients, or are you just seeing it as a part of the process once they're a new client?
Yeah, it's not something I have used as a selling point at this stage. As I said, I've had a really big renewed focus on it just in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. But if I'm going to put myself out there as like an expert or somebody who specialises in this sort of thing, I'd personally like to get a few more runs on the board. Like, I don't know, maybe that's just a personality thing. I'm not a fake it till you make it kind of person. I'm okay, I can really do this. I'm great at it. So now I'm not that I would say that, but probably, but like when I say I'm a retirement specialist, or I can, help people with pensions and retirement income, like I've been doing that for 20 years, so I can say that with absolute confidence. So yeah, I think it's something that I would probably use as more of a selling point in the future once, I'm more confident with it. But what it's added to my business in the meantime is the confidence to deal with those clients and prospects that do raise it in a confident manner so that they feel safe investing with me. So when I ask them these questions and they say, yeah, actually, I do have these issues, I can now come from a position where I've thought about it and I've got some real answers for them and that I can ask them questions that are meaningful and actually help them unpack their values a bit and come up with a portfolio that works for them. Because the other thing too is that, you generally have to actually balance their idealism with their other goals as well. So, if you come to me and you want a very low-cost, diversified portfolio, but you also have really strict ethical requirements, these things aren't necessarily compatible. So we have to work through the process of like, okay, well, if you want the most actively filtered managed funds, they tend to be the most expensive. So are we light green? Are we deep green?
Are we deep green? Are you fluoro green? How green are we talking?
Yeah, or, do you actually want to save on those MERs? So definitely it's been very important for me to have done the work that I have done. because there are at least 3 or 4 clients that I would have completely lost credibility with if I had been able to have those conversations. And they're actually 3 or 4 really good clients. Like people that tend to take a real interest in this stuff tend to be upper middle income earners.
Interesting.
Which is sort of like, the sweet spot for me, really.
Yeah.
And I think that these clients could possibly have turned around and walked out on me if I'd just thrown my hands up and said, I don't know about that. I don't, want to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's definitely been valuable being able to have these conversations, and it's helped me clarify things for myself as well. Like, what do I actually think is important?
Yep. Yeah, and that's a really good point. I guess there is a level of self-reflection. Thankfully, well, depending on how you measure the concept of thankfully, but as I haven't advised for the last couple of years, I haven't needed to go on that journey myself personally. So who knows? I could be lining up specifically for the caged eggs. I've got no idea at this stage. What I was going to say earlier about the attraction of clients via, if you were to use ethical investments as an attraction mechanism, do you find that the cost is prohibitive in a way? So I guess rather than examining that question from the view of, whether you an expertise in ethical investments or not, but do you find that there's a prohibitive cost attached to someone that does want to enter into this type of investing? And is there sort of a level where it scares people away in your experience? And is there a sweet spot, I guess? Is there a benefit to cost amount that you're finding to be easy to achieve?
So look, I had one client in particular who had very conflicting goals, in that he wanted to take a strident stance on climate change and divesting himself from fossil fuels. But at the same time, he was a barefooter. He'd read Scott Pape, and he wanted index type fees. And so I had to have the whole conversation with him about how these two things don't go together. You can't pay like 0.2% and have an ethically filtered portfolio. That's just not how it's going to work. So I was able to come to a compromise point with him where, we use the ethically filtered ETFs. Both Van Eck and BetaShares now have ETFs that are, I suppose, like filtered index approaches, if you like, that try and upweight more desirable or greener companies and downweight or exclude completely the baddies, if you like. So we were able to meet in the middle on that, and just for good measure, for a bit of diversification to lower the cost, there is some pure index in his portfolio as well. So because that was super important to him. So we ended up with an approach where we had roughly, a third in just straight index, where I had to say to him, like, look, there's going to be guns and some cigarettes and booze, and you're just going to have everything in there, right? Just because if that's your goal, you just got to accept that. And then we had roughly a third of the portfolio in the filtered ETFs, and then the other third were in sort of more actively managed and more expensive managed funds that took a more proactive stance. And that was sort of where we landed at the end of a couple of long conversations.
That makes sense, because then you're and that, I mean, ultimately is the role of a financial planner. You have competing goals, and then you have to have conversations, which ultimately leads to the best outcome, considering there are competing goals. Here's ultimately where you're most comfortable. And my God, that is real advice. Is there, considering this is the ethical, advice series, is there anything that you've found surprising about the conversations with clients about ESG investing? Like, as it's become, over the last 12 months, you said you've sort of had a little bit more of a renewed focus on it. Was there something that sort of took you by surprise at any stage but beyond sort of, as you mentioned earlier, like your clients saying, actually, yeah, this does mean a lot to me. And you saying, oh, wow, like I probably should have thought about that earlier, but has there been anything else? Has there been a theme, any kind of themes, any kind of trends? If you think about sort of your client base and those that you're having conversations with, is there anything at all that stands out?
Oh, look, so if we want to talk about the trend isn't surprising at all. Like you said, the trend is towards increased environmental consciousness. The trend is towards divesting from fossil fuels and, moving to a more climate-friendly style of portfolio. I guess what was surprising, though, is that there was also great variation. So you know how earlier I said it was sort of 50-50, half had ideas and half didn't. What surprised me about the half of the clients, the 50% that said they did have some ethical concerns, were actually really varied. So I'd say like probably half of them were, on the sustainability thing, but the other half were like all over the place. They ranged from, I just prefer not to have any, guns and weaponry, just the really obvious stuff,
right? Yes.
Through to like the extreme of, I only want to invest in like, wind farms and things that make the world better. Like, okay, that's a pretty wide range. And the other thing that you find when you start sort of digging into the managed funds is some of the managed funds that call themselves ethical would actually not pass the filter of most of these clients. So there's a couple of funds out there. I won't name names because I might get some hate mail. There are a couple of funds that have ethical in their name, but when you actually read the PDS or look into them, it's really just, like I said, that really basic level of that every ethical investor would expect. Like, we're just not going to blow people up and kill them with cigarettes, and that's it.
Right.
Oh, yes. Great effort, guys. So yeah, that surprised me as well. Just because it's got ethical in the name doesn't mean that it's actually going to beat your client's goals at all.
Yeah, I guess that's my only critique of it from the point of view of the advisor is once the Pandora box has been opened, it's hard to close, and it's hard to sometimes find a perfect solution for everyone because everyone is so varied. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, I guess, over the next couple of years. I think probably, the ethical fund, which could be any fund, unnamed, remains unnamed, but, it probably might have started out that was ethical. And then at this stage, we consider this ethical. And then 5 years and 10 years from now, maybe what we call ethical now is no longer ethical. And there's a journey, I think, that collectively as investors we're taking. I hope we don't make it overly complex. I hope eventually we just arrive at a point where, I guess not everyone's happy about everything, but we're making decisions that I guess lead to a better world ultimately. And we're using capitalism to do that, because at the end of the day, if advice comes down to, can you help me pick amongst the 20 companies that I'm able to invest in on the stock market, then that's not going to be fun for anyone, because, it's going to be very difficult to do. But at the same time, I think it's a great thing. I think being emotionally engaged in your investments, and it's kind of interesting, like from that point of view, because if you think about the trends in financial planning, it was all about investments. And then we sort of over time brought in this idea of, coaching and being emotionally engaged in goals and plans and what you want out of life. And then at a certain point, maybe investments didn't get the attention that it deserved. But now where there's this whole topic of emotional engagement that we're going to be able to, I guess, lean on and say, actually, this is how your investments performed, but this is actually, you're still making the world a better place so you can sleep well at night knowing that you're having an effect on the world without having to pick up your stick and your sign that says, don't burn down the tree, right? So like it's kind of, it is a good news story at the end of the day as well. So very pleased about that. I mean, I'm all for freedom of speech, go protest. But at the end of the day, I think this is a much better and effective and efficient way to stop something like Rio doing what they did. You know, like, no one's going to let that happen.
200,000 people out on the street. Do you think Rio would care?
No, of course not. But Australian Super turning up and saying, no, sorry, team, that doesn't fly. That's great. That's fantastic. And that's a huge. It's a huge. I would say ethical investments are a huge benefit for advisors in that it adds another entire overlay of conversation that can be had and discussed. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, advisors just trying to add as many items in that column of value. And this is one of many that exist now. Liz, out of respect for your time, thank you so much for coming on. I'm so glad, considering you're award-winning, XY award-winning advisor, and I'm glad we finally have you on the podcast to talk about this really important topic. So thank you very much for coming on.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right, cheers.
Cheers, bye.